Every game has a story. Only one is a legend. The Legend of Zelda, made by Nintendo, is one of the most respected and revered series of all time. None of the entries are flawless, but most of them are considered among both the best games of their respective consoles and the best games ever made. It's a series that means a lot to me as well. I experienced a few of the entries very early on when I started to get into video games, and they have remained amongst the highest points in gaming for me. Whenever I put a Zelda title in, I know I'm in for an incredible journey, and I always feel a sense of great anticipation when I come across one I've not played. For this ranking, I'm going to be as true to myself as I can, and like all of my other videos, this is entirely my viewpoints and opinions, as being objective about these games is next to impossible. All of the games I will be discussing are in the top 10 to 20 games available on their systems, and you'd be a fool to have access to a Nintendo system and not have at least one or two of these games for it. Plus, there is the inevitable reality that I will be ranking your favorites lower. I can only profess that every game is worthy of the praise it gets from its fans, and I have a lot of love for each of these, even if they might show up at 6th or 13th place. It feels almost inevitable to see comments saying such and such a game is criminally underrated, and yet I don't feel like that critique holds much weight for the series. When you consider all of the other games that would be supplanted by your high placement of an entry, you might understand the sense of ire you draw from other fans for expressing yourself. Simply put, I just don't share your same history with the game, and thus my preferences will be skewed differently to yours. This is the video that has taken the most time for me to prepare and research out of all of the ones I've done so far, because I want to do justice to a video game series that has earned a permanent place on the Mount Rushmore of the medium, and because most of these I only got access to this year, so I've had quite the backlog to get through. Finally, I do feel the need to explain why not all of the games are here. I did my due diligence to play as many of these as I could, but due to Nintendo's weird criteria of selecting games to preserve on modern systems, several titles were just beyond my capability to play. I'm not big on emulators, nor am I made of money, so unfortunately, all of the DS and 3DS and Four Swords games are not here. Same goes for the CDI adventures, though it sounds like I'm not missing out on much with those. I'm also not including the spin-off games like Hyrule Warriors, Cadence of Hyrule, or Link's Crossbow Training, due mostly to wanting to keep the focus to the mainline titles, and because, let's be honest, Link's Crossbow Training would clearly crush the competition if included. So, let's get started praising a series that clearly doesn't get that much love. Zelda II is often described by one of three titles: the black sheep of the series, the most unconventional, and the hardest of them all. There's a degree of truth to all of these descriptors, especially the difficulty, but you need to remember that there was no reason the game had to follow in the footsteps of its older brother. Plus, it still contains many of the same building blocks that made the first game work, it's just obscured by the switch to a different playing perspective. I'm glad the series switched back to the style of the first, but it's still an interesting artifact in the series, and Zelda II is more influential than you might think. The Triforce of Courage, an expansive roster of NPCs, magic, Dark Link, and several important recurring character and location names all got their start here. I feel like this game's faults have become more pronounced with time and tide. Later entries fleshed out the concepts of this one better and have cemented the style of the series. Thus, in retrospect, it makes this one seem like the one that just couldn't get with the program. That's not to say that the criticism is entirely unfair or unwarranted. The random encounters in the overworld get annoying quickly. The shift towards the side-scrolling perspective robs the game of the uniqueness of the first, and it's punishing with its difficulty. Without save states or the rewind feature, this game would be considered unplayable by most younger audiences. When I played it for the first time on the Zelda Collector's Edition package for GameCube 20 years ago, I could never get very far. And even when you do make it further in the game, the payoff isn't nearly as satisfying as it is with the other titles. Zelda II is not terrible, but I'd rather play any other entry in the series several times over before going back to this one. The Oracle games really are a combined package and should be discussed together. The interconnectivity between the two is more in-depth than when Pokemon first popularized the notion. It's less about emphasizing the social aspect and more that these two form a larger story, though each of the pieces stand fine on its own. I played Seasons before Ages, so Oracle of Ages contained the finale. Far more puzzle-focused, I had a few times where I stumbled around for a solution or got lost. Weirdly, I made it through the notorious Jabu Jabu's belly without much of an issue beyond backtracking, but it was the mermaid's cave that was the big nadir. I went into it not realizing I needed to complete part of it in the past, and so after having won the original key through a tough minigame, I had to do quite a bit to get the second key to even enter the dungeon. Beyond that, I enjoyed the switch hook, some of the interconnected story points and elements, and I found manipulating time to be a lot more fun than just simply changing the seasons. Both Ages and Seasons are mirrors for each other, meaning that it's often only minor things that determine which gets placed above the other, as the games more or less offer the same quality of an experience, though it does mean it's fairly easy to get one mixed up with the other. I wouldn't describe either as a hidden gem in the Zelda franchise, but they are reliably great Game Boy games that would reward anybody who checks them out. I've noticed a trend with Zelda. The second game to come out on a system will often be remarkably similar to the predecessor in key ways. Majora's Mask and Tears of the Kingdom, for example, play similar to Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild, respectively, to the point where they can feel like expansions or DLC to their predecessors. When you're building off of Link's Awakening, you're already working from a fantastic template, so all you can really do is give yourself an identity while having gameplay that's rooted in the great works of the past. Oracle of Seasons is a lot more combat-focused than Ages. Onyx drove me crazy. It does rely on a lot of the similar tricks from the past, and it understandably has a sense of disposalness amongst the series. Like, if you're going to skip some of the games, the Oracle series is an understandable choice, yet they're still rooted in classic Zelda, so I feel like they're worth your time. The Seasons gimmick is done well. I enjoyed having a whole sublayer beneath Holodrum to explore, I enjoyed the different types of seeds and experimenting with them to see what they could all do, and there's some genuinely clever puzzles here, with some fun side characters like the Skeleton Pirates and the Sub-Rosas. I was also surprised to see some influence from the N64 games here, given that 2D Zelda and 3D Zelda largely feel like their own design camps. The first time I came across the windmill next to the village and heard a Game Boy version of the Song of Storms, I was instantly reminded of when this game came out, and thus allowed me to appreciate the winning streak the Oracle series were continuing with Zelda at the time. Capcom did a terrific job showing they could handle the series in a smaller format, and thus they would be given a greater challenge later. The 3D Zelda I've heard placed towards the bottom the most, I feel like Skyward Sword carries quite the stigma. Obviously the motion controls hindered its accessibility, but there's more to it than that. The dungeons often feel a bit clunky and rather routine in their themes. The story really doesn't stand out as much from other entries as I was led to believe, the open world feels rather void, and Fi has a Data from first season TNG level of annoyance. It was the first time the series formula started to become rather obvious to fans. Thankfully, my first playthrough of the game came through the Switch remaster, which, ironically, has sold more copies in a fraction of time than the original's entire lifespan. So I had perhaps the best first impression of the game, without the mandatory motion controls, Fi's annoyance turned down, and a few other quality of life enhancements. Ultimately, I think this is a fine if unimpressive Zelda game. It's got its strengths, like its watercolor art style, some of the finest dungeons like Ancient Cistern and Skyloft, some great items like the Beetle, and I personally like flying more than horseback riding. However, it mostly just plods along doing traditional Zelda things without doing anything unique with them, and the innovations it does bring don't all work. This game actually introduced the idea of breakable equipment and stamina, two more contentious features of later titles. Often Skyward Sword feels like it's going through the motions, which feels like a condemnation in a series that loves to innovate and consistently carries a high standard of quality. It's still worthy of the Zelda name, and has a lot of value since traditional Zelda kicks the snot out of 90% of video games, but it's also one of the more routine entries I've experienced. A rather unassuming adventure that slowly yields forth some intriguing ideas, the original Legend of Zelda is a humble beginning to the franchise. The simplicity of it is wondrous. The openness of its world treats you with more respect than a lot of its successors, and it's incredibly compelling to play even now. However, you will most likely need a guide to complete it, otherwise you're going to end up doing a lot of backtracking if you mess up. It has the same problem with its difficulty that other NES titles share. That Death Mountain section and Ganon fight so do not play fair, and you may find that you miss some of the advancements that the sequels offer. Plus, it can get a little monotonous at times with relatively simple offerings of enemy variety. The dungeons can just feel like slightly different colored versions of each other. It still retains its import and is quite impressive given its historical context, and it's still eminently playable. On a more personal side note, my parents claim that both my dad and uncle were playing this game the night I was born, so it's a game that has a lot of significance to me. The original Legend of Zelda may be a little clunky, but it's remarkable how relevant it has remained in inspiring the rest of the series to this day. In many ways, both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are spiritual sequels to the game, wearing its influence proudly on their shoulders, and thus the original's legacy has been carved in stone forevermore. I perhaps played the Minish Cap at the wrong time. It was the fourth Zelda game in a row that I played within a month, and I was starting to feel some fatigue. Plus, I'm more of a fan of the 3D entries, so I'm sure some of its greatness was lost on me. Personally, I found this to be one of the hardest games to beat without checking a strategy guide, and I couldn't get behind a lot of the animation work. Yet, it's remarkable how the changing in size led to some inventive puzzles. The town of Hyrule is one of the most lively and engaging versions ever offered, and I always appreciate when Ganon is not the main villain. Vati is fairly standard as far as video game antagonists go, but his end fight was harder than most of the others that I have done, so it felt so satisfying to put him down. The Minish people also helped to give this game a stronger sense of fantasy and fairy tale-like wonder than most of the rest of the entries provide, so they are one of the more enduring aspects of this game. Some of the side quests here are worth doing as well. The Minish Cap offers a great blending of the style of A Link to the Past with the charm of the Wind Waker, which makes it a solid recommendation to all fans, and it remains perhaps the best GBA game I have ever played. Twilight Princess is a contentious entry. Wherever it gets placed on a ranking, you'll have fans offering their steadfast opinions to the contrary. Much like Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild, this was an entry point into the series for a particular generation, and thus it gets treated as almost a sacred object at times. I personally was turned off by the move away from the charm of the Wind Waker. I hated that Ganondorf was once again made the final bad guy instead of an infinitely creepier and more unique villain in Zant. I felt like the game dragged too often, and its flavor of melodrama was a bit much. Thus, even though I initially played some of it back in 2006, it wasn't until 2022 that I finally did a full run of the game, and while I stand by my criticisms, I found a lot to love about it. It has the best collection of dungeons in all of the 3D entries, the best collection of unique items, the best companion character in Midna, and I was won over on the art style being more interesting than it was initially presented. In a lot of ways, Twilight Princess reminds me of Assassin's Creed 3. Its slow pacing, its seeming inability to take a joke, and its weird difficulty curve give way to captivation rarely seen in this series, and it becomes hard to put down. It's still not my favorite, but I better sympathize with those for whom it is. And I too am in the camp that feels like Nintendo should get a permanent black mark on their record for not making both this and the Wind Waker available on the Switch as of yet. Grezzo has done a remarkable job with the various remakes and handheld games, so it only makes sense to let them develop Echoes of Wisdom, a brand new mainline game for the Switch. The first time since the CDI games that Zelda is the playable protagonist, I was relieved that she immediately felt different to Link and brought her own set of challenges to the table. I appreciate the reuse of the Link's Awakening remake art style, as it has a wonderful toy-like charm that fits right in with the fairy tale world of Zelda. I hardly ever traveled by horseback as I wanted to explore the world and see what I could find, and I found Tri was a great companion. They never overstayed their welcome with tedious handholding, they provide crucial gameplay mechanics, and there's a lovely emotional progression to them. The emphasis on puzzle solving and figuring out the right echoes to use made for some great aha moments, as there was never one right solution. And I love that most of the progression was non-linear. You have a few points where you can do a set of dungeons in any order, and I'd love to see this idea continue. All that said, the reduction in challenge factor means that none of the dungeons stood out. Most of the bosses, including the final one, were pretty easy. And as fun as it is to get echoes to fight for you, it's not the same as wielding the sword yourself. I love that Nintendo has proven that they are willing to revisit the classic style of Zelda games at the same time as they continue with the Breath of the Wild style. And if they can keep this alternating schedule going, they may win back a few cynical fans. A watershed moment in open-world video gaming, and the title that put the Switch on the map, Breath of the Wild is a great student of the past and offers a bold push to a new style that has mass appeal. There are definitely jaded fans who hate how the classic style of Zelda has been pushed to the side in favor of something that feels perhaps a bit too close to Skyrim or The Witcher 3. A lot of series have made this push: Assassin's Creed, Tomb Raider, Star Wars, Harry Potter, Halo, Gears of War, Lego, and so on. It makes Zelda feel less unique amongst the landscape of video games, and I too share some of this criticism. I'm also not a fan of the weapon breaking system, nor the food cooking mechanic, and the ability to be killed so easily made it that I was scared of the game at times. Yet my determination to see it through was well worth the effort. I missed the collection of dungeons, but I feel like the reassignment towards individual shrines made it so I could craft the game's pacing in my favor. It's also one of the few in the series that is both an experience you can pick up and play for a few minutes or for several hours, and you will be rewarded and feel like you're making progress every time. It has both that sense of intimacy and grand scale, making it one of the more personable games in the series. Plus, it contains my favorite version of Zelda, the single best opening section in the series, and one of the most intriguing story hooks I've seen in gaming, with Link and Zelda having failed before the game begins. I admire what Breath of the Wild has done for the series, and even if I'm a little hesitant to say it's one of the best, I will say it's more unique amongst open worlds and a better application of the Zelda elements than its detractors make it out to be. A Link to the Past was the title I was most looking forward to playing once I got a Switch. This is where the series found its groove, and even great chapters like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess couldn't have happened without this game laying the foundation. A Link to the Past is the easiest of the games to get into, given its determination to get you right into the action. It has a large assortment of dungeons and confidently offers them at just the right time. In fact, the Skull Woods instantly became one of my new favorite dungeons, and I marveled that a 30-plus-year-old game held that kind of surprise for me. It also is making good of the promise of the first two titles, while making the gameplay vastly more appealing. While the first two laid the groundwork, A Link to the Past was a revelation, setting forth a near-perfect template the series could go off of for a while. And this is the first game to start to emphasize a story that linearly connects the pieces. I do have my issues. The difficulty curve is a little steep. I had a hard time knowing where to go to get the items I needed to access the next dungeon. I found going back and forth between the two worlds to be a bit laborious by the end, and it does start to feel long in its length. All that said, A Link to the Past stands tall and proud amongst the great and important gaming titles of the 90s and deserves its acclaimed reputation. The best 1-2 punch I've ever seen in video gaming. It's hard not to struggle in deciding between Majora's Mask and its illustrious predecessor for the best N64 entry. Mask has some clear merits. It has what is still the best story in the series. Its willingness to take chances is unparalleled, and it has the best collection of side quests in the series. Those quests make it feel like they are of equal paramount importance to the main story to complete before you can put the game down. And my goodness, the game drains all the emotion it can out of you and earns both its tears and heartwarming moments. My gripes with it are still the same ones I had when the game first came out. It often feels like it's teetering on the edge of falling apart due to its glitches. I hate the saving system. A lot of the time you are standing around waiting for the right hour so you can progress on a quest, and both the Pirate's Fortress and Great Bay Temple are amongst my least favorite sections in a Zelda game. Yet those merits I mentioned earlier, plus one of the most inventive dungeons with the Stone Tower Temple, make it so that it's easy to dismiss my issues. There's a richness to Majora's Mask that is hard to beat. It remains a must-play for all fans of video games in general, and it's likely to stay with you longer than most entries. I never knew what to make of Link's Awakening. It was clearly looking towards a link to the past for a lot of things, and was pared down even from that. Its follow-up was Ocarina of Time, which is not an entry any game wants to be positioned next to. Plus, I heard that the limitations from the Game Boy detracted from the experience, so I didn't have a lot of interest in seeking it out. I finally corrected this when I played the Switch remake, and I pray to all that is holy I will never make the same mistake again. There's a special joy when playing this one. Its seeming microscopic world and condensed vision makes it one of the most profitable in the bang-for-your-buck entertainment department, and it became the forerunner and a teacher for many entries to come, including Ocarina. It makes a convincing case for why 2D Zelda titles should still be developed alongside the grander 3D entries, and its Twin Peaks-inspired narrative makes for a mesmerizing experience. It still has the obtuse spikes of confusion that most Zelda titles suffer from. Its multi-item trading quest is just a bit too long for my taste, and it's actually necessary to complete the story, and it too starts to feel drawn out by the end. Nevertheless, this is a great antidote to the cynicism some fans seem to harbor towards the more recent games, and it deserves a lot more attention from those that are dead set against the 2D titles. For those that want to try it out, I highly recommend the Switch version over the original Game Boy versions, simply because it's easier to manage your items and because the art style is so wonderful. But you really can't go wrong with either option. Because I got several Zelda games when I received the Switch, I put off playing Tears of the Kingdom for a few months since I had just spent 40 to 50 hours playing its predecessor. That actually worked in the game's favor, and I was once again caught completely off guard when I played it through to the story's end. This was the Assassin's Creed Odyssey to Breath of the Wild's origins. It won me over on a style for the series I was previously reticent about, and it fixed several issues I had with the previous game. Its dungeons and shrines were quite a bit better. The final fight was actually a rewarding challenge even after spending dozens of hours prepping for it. The entirety of the story was much improved, and it pulled back on how much the game world wanted to kill you just for stepping into the wrong place. I still don't care for the weapon durability or food mechanics, but I accepted them as part of the package and was able to work with them to my benefit. I love the sense of discovery the game is endowed with by adding a construction emphasis to its powers. It's deeply engaging to experiment with the Zonai devices and weapon fusion to create your own grand moments, though I wish you didn't have to drop items in front of you in order to fuse them with your sword or shield. Tears of the Kingdom quickly rose through an already crowded selection of great games to become one of my personal favorites of the series, and I look forward to many more years discovering its wonders. Like a lot of folks my age, Ocarina of Time was the entry point into the Zelda franchise, and it colored a lot of my preferences about video games in general. It broke open the possibilities of adventure gaming and essentially became a walking patent office with the innovations it brought to the medium. But you probably know all of this, and others have talked about its lasting legacy far better than I ever could. So the only unique-ish thing I can bring to the table is my own feelings on the game. This is a perfect example of actual nostalgia for me, a game which transports me back in time much like its protagonist, and it remains a joy to play now, even over 25 years since its release. Even its less than stellar aspects like the fishing and Poe hunts have become part of the charm to me, and thus it's hard to be too critical about it. Much like other Zelda titles, the way forward can sometimes be vague, it relies a little too much on your willingness to explore every nook and cranny of the world in order to just progress through the main story, and other games have since surpassed it in many aspects. Yet sometimes something remains the king for a reason. The Forest and Spirit Temples still rank amongst my favorite dungeons of the series, and I think the overall collection of dungeons is second only to Twilight Princess. The use of the ocarina and music throughout is inspired. The Z-targeting does wonders for its combat. The horseback riding lends such an air of freedom to the traversal, and it has the best pacing of the series. It never spends too long on one task, and the solutions to a lot of the individual puzzles are intuitive and immensely rewarding. Ocarina is a time capsule of a perfect storm within gaming, and even if it's rarely the #1 title for each fan anymore, I echo Dan Houser's comment that anyone who makes 3D games that says they didn't take something from this or Super Mario 64 is lying. On a side note, I've played quite a bit of the Master Quest version. It's definitely an interesting novelty that's worth checking out if you're a massive fan of the game, but in my opinion, the original is the superior version. The most charming of the series, The Wind Waker knows how to give you just the right amount of weight to silliness to appeal to just about everybody. The art style remains one of the most unique in the medium. Its characters all have distinct personalities, including Link finally. It has some of my favorite musical tunes in the series, and its sense of epic sprawling adventure is unrivaled. The seafaring is remarkably simple and satisfying, and is up there with Black Flag as being one of the best games for sailing fun. I wish its dungeons were a little better. It can get a bit too easy at times, and yeah, even I felt like reclaiming the Triforce towards the end gets tedious. However, its overload of style, the refinement of 3D Zelda mechanics and systems, plus one of the most endearing hero's journey stories that gaming has ever done, makes The Wind Waker a firm favorite within the community. And personally speaking, it's the title that means the most to me. It was the most I ever connected with Link as a character, and thus his successes and failures felt like mine as well. Until Mass Effect, I never felt more like I was an actual part of the experience when playing a video game. There's a joy that creeps onto my face whenever I think of The Wind Waker, and it is amongst the strongest contenders that I've ever played for the title of my all-time favorite video game. I feel like ranking lists should be viewed more as ongoing contests rather than listings set in stone. In my experience, I've never felt the exact same way twice about a series after running through the contenders again. And so whatever placement I offer at any one given moment is more of a current check-in rather than a definitive all-time outcome. This holds doubly true with Zelda, as all of the entries are amongst the strongest in their fields. And sometimes the deciding factor in a ranking is your own personal attachment to the game rather than something more concrete. Regardless, the Legend of Zelda series has perhaps the most impressive batting average of any long-running franchise with the possible exception of Mario, and even then, I still tend to lean towards Zelda as the better of the two. I hope the series has meant something to you as well, and if not, consider doing yourself a massive favor and pick up one of these titles. I don't think you'll regret spending your time saving a mystical land with deeply engaging gameplay, mind-bending puzzles, and a grand escapism that most other games can only dream of achieving.